The year was 1884, and the wind out on the high plains didn't care about your story. It only cared about tearing things down. It ripped through the cottonwoods and screamed at the walls of a lonely ranch house, a place that sat a mile from anyone who might hear you scream back. Inside lived a man named Stephen Hale. He was 31, built like the barns he could raise with his own 2 hands, and he had a face that looked like it was carved from stone and regret. They called him the Ghost Rancher, not because he was scary, but because he was already gone. He wasn't always this way. People say his laugh used to roll across the valley, but then his father died, and the woman he was meant to marry rode off with a richer man, and the laughter just stopped. The silence moved in and never paid rent. He spoke only to his horses and the coming weather. He worked from the first crack of dawn to the last flicker of light. The rhythm of the work was the only thing that kept the ghosts in his head quiet. He'd mend a fence, he'd fix a hinge, he'd feed the horses. The silence was his only friend, and it never asked for a thing. But one grey morning, the rhythm broke. The wind brought a new sound, the groan of wagon wheels, the pathetic cry of a tired mule. Stephen put down his axe. A beaten-down wagon was pulling up to his gate. A young woman climbed down. Her dress was frayed, her boots caked in mud. She looked like she'd been chewed up and spat out by the world. Behind her, a frail, older woman eased her way to the ground, her bones seeming to creak louder than the wagon. "Sir," the younger one said, her voice tired but not broken, "we were told you might need help. We can cook, clean, work for a roof over our heads, just until spring." Stephen looked them over. The young one, Clara May, had hands chapped raw from the cold. The old one, Mabel, was trying to hide a bone-rattling cough behind a thin shawl. He could have said no, should have said no. Every instinct told him to send them on their way, back to whatever misery they came from. But something else, something he thought had died in him long ago, stirred. Loneliness, maybe, or just a flicker of the man he used to be. "There's an empty bunkhouse," he grunted. "Stove works. You can stay, if you earn your keep." Relief washed over Clara's face. "Thank you, sir," she breathed. He just tipped his hat. "Stephen," he said, and that was that. They moved in like 2 stray cats, quiet and grateful for the warmth. Clara started cleaning his main cabin, sweeping away years of dust and silence. Mabel cooked, her trembling hands making simple beans and salt pork taste like a feast. For the first time in forever, Stephen came home to the smell of a hot meal and the sound of quiet conversation. He didn't say much, but he listened. He learned their story. Clara's husband, dead from fever. Their wagon, robbed near Abilene. Every other ranch had turned them away. He saw how Clara cared for her mother without a word of complaint, how she'd work until her hands bled and still manage a tired smile. He was starting to think he'd made the right choice, that maybe, just maybe, having them here wasn't a mistake. But things are never that simple, are they? One afternoon, while mending a tack in the barn, he found something on the dusty floor, a small, silver locket. It must have fallen from Clara's things. He almost called out to her, almost just handed it back. But curiosity, a feeling as foreign to him as joy, made him pause. His rough fingers fumbled with the clasp. It snapped open. Inside wasn't a picture of her dead husband. It was a portrait of a man he'd never seen before, a man with cold, calculating eyes, dressed in a suit that cost more than Stephen's entire ranch. He was older, with a cruel twist to his lips. This wasn't the hard-working farmer she'd described. This man looked like he owned people, not land. Stephen snapped the locket shut, the click echoing in the silent barn. He slipped it into his pocket, his mind racing. Her story was a lie, every word of it, and as he stood there, the cold metal pressing against his palm, he realized his lonely ranch wasn't a shelter for two desperate women. It was a hiding place, and he had no idea what they were hiding from. Stephen didn't confront her. Not yet. He decided to watch, to listen. He became a ghost in his own home, observing them when they thought he was out on the range. And what he saw turned his blood to ice. Mabel's terrible rattling cough. It vanished the moment she thought she was alone. He saw her through the bunkhouse window one afternoon, moving with a spryness that defied her frail appearance, humming a tune while she tidied up. But the second she heard his boots on the gravel path, the act started again. The hacking cough, the trembling hands, the weary sigh. It was all a performance. They were playing him. But why? For a roof and a few meals? It didn't add up. The man in the locket, Mabel's fake illness. This was bigger than simple grifting. These women were running scared. He started leaving the locket in plain sight, first on the kitchen table, then on the mantelpiece. He'd watch Clara's eyes flicker towards it, a flash of pure panic in their depths, before she'd snatch it up and hide it away. She knew he knew, and he knew she knew. The silence in the house changed. It was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, thick with unspoken questions and hidden truths. A silent war was being waged within the walls of his home. The tension finally snapped one night. The wind was howling, a proper blizzard was bearing down on them. He was outside, securing the horses, when he heard their voices raised in the bunkhouse. He crept closer, pressing his ear against the rough wood. "He knows, Clara." It was Mabel's voice, sharp and terrified, not the weak whisper she used around him. "He found the locket. I saw it on the table. We have to go, now." "Go where?" Clara shot back, her voice desperate. "Into that storm. We'd freeze before we made it a mile. We stay. We stick to the story." "The story is falling apart," Mabel hissed. "This wasn't the plan. He was supposed to be a simple, lonely fool we could rob and leave." "But he's not simple, Clara. He watches everything. We need the rest of the money, and then we disappear." Money, so that was it. They thought he had money hidden away. Stephen's heart turned to a cold, hard knot in his chest. He wasn't angry. He was something far worse, disappointed. He had almost let himself believe in their story, in their quiet kindness. He had almost let the silence in his life be filled. Now he knew it was all a lie, a carefully constructed trap. He pushed himself away from the wall and walked back towards the main cabin, the wind whipping snow into his face, but he barely felt the cold. The storm inside him was far more brutal. He walked into his home, the place they had so carefully cleaned and organized, and he saw it for what it was. A stage for their deception. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't just throw them out into the storm. That wasn't his way. But he couldn't let them stay. He had to end this. Tonight. He waited until the storm was at its peak, the wind screaming like a banshee. He strode over to the bunkhouse and threw the door open without knocking. They both jumped, their faces etched with guilt and fear. "Pack your things," he said, his voice flat and dead, the sound of a man who had buried his last hope. "You're leaving." Clara stared at him, her eyes wide. "In this? We'll die out there." "Better than dying in here," Stephen said, his gaze hard as iron. He wasn't bluffing. He was done. He'd give them food, a lantern, and point them toward the road. What happened next was up to God. He didn't care anymore. "Please," Clara whispered, taking a step forward, "you don't understand." "I understand you're liars," he cut her off. "I understand you've been playing me for a fool. I understand you think I have money you can steal. Well, the show's over." He turned to leave, but then a new sound cut through the wind. Hoofbeats, a lot of them, coming fast. All three of them froze. Who would be riding in a blizzard this bad, in the middle of the night? Stephen peered through the doorway into the swirling snow. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness, cutting yellow swaths through the white chaos. A posse, headed straight for his ranch. And in that moment, Stephen understood. Whatever these women were running from, it had finally caught up to them. He looked from the approaching lights back to Clara's terrified face. His plan to throw them out was gone, replaced by a terrible sinking feeling. He had a choice to make, and he had about 30 seconds to make it. Let the posse take them and wash his hands of the whole mess, or hide them and step into the middle of a war he knew nothing about. The lead rider was getting closer. He could make out the glint of a star on his chest. The sheriff. Why would the sheriff lead a posse in a blizzard for two simple grifters? Unless they weren't simple grifters at all. Unless they had done something far, far worse than lie about a dead husband. The root cellar, Stephen barked, his mind snapping into focus. Now, don't make a sound. Clara and Mabel didn't hesitate. They scrambled towards the main cabin as Stephen bought them a few precious seconds, stepping out onto the porch, his hand resting on the axe he'd left by the door. The sheriff and 3 deputies reined in their horses, their faces grim and half frozen. "Hail," the sheriff shouted over the wind. "Got word you had some visitors." Sheriff Brody was a man with a weasel's eyes and a reputation for being bought and sold. Stephen didn't like him, and the feeling was mutual. "Just me and the storm," Stephen said, keeping his voice even. Brody's eyes scanned the ranch. "Funny, we're looking for 2 women. One young, one old. Last seen heading this way. You telling me you haven't seen 'em?" "I'm telling you it's a bad night to be out asking questions," Stephen replied, not moving an inch. The air crackled. It wasn't just the cold, it was a standoff. Brody's gaze flickered to the lamp-lit window of the main cabin. "They're not just thieves, Hale. They're wanted for murder." Murder. The word hung in the frozen air. The murder of that rich man in the locket, Stephen thought. His gut twisted. He was hiding killers. Brody swung down from his horse, his deputies following suit. "We've got a warrant to search the property." He held up a piece of paper. It was probably fake, but in this storm, out in the middle of nowhere, it didn't matter. It was his word against Stephen's, and Brody had 3 guns backing him up. "Go ahead," Stephen said, stepping aside. "Won't find anything." He prayed he was right. He prayed the women had been quiet. He led them into the cabin. The place was warm, a pot of coffee still on the stove. Brody's eyes narrowed. Drinking a lot of coffee for a man who lives alone. He kicked at the rug covering the cellar door. "What's down there?" "Roots and preserves," Stephen said calmly. "Feel free to check." Brody gestured to one of his deputies. "You heard him." The deputy pulled the rug aside and lifted the heavy wooden door. Cold, damp air washed into the room. He held his lantern over the opening, peering down into the darkness. Stephen's heart hammered against his ribs. It was a small cellar. There weren't many places to hide, any sound, any movement, and it was over. The deputy stared into the blackness for a long moment. Then he shrugged. "Nothing but dirt and jars," he said, closing the door. Stephen let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Brody looked frustrated, angry. He clearly expected to find them here. He stormed around the small cabin, kicking at furniture, his eyes darting everywhere. He knew they were here. He just couldn't prove it. "They were here!" Brody snarled, his face inches from Stephen's. "And when I find them, I'm gonna remember you lied to me, Hale. I'll be back." He turned and stomped out of the cabin, his men following him. Stephen watched from the doorway as they mounted their horses and disappeared back into the blizzard. Only when their lights were completely swallowed by the snow did he bolt the door and pull the rug away from the cellar. He lifted the door. Clara was looking up, her face pale, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He's gone," Stephen said, "for now." He helped them out. Mabel was shaking uncontrollably, her fake cough replaced by genuine, terrified sobs. Clara grabbed Stephen's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "He's lying," she said, her voice a fierce whisper. "We didn't murder anyone." Stephen looked into her eyes, searching for the lie he'd seen there before. But this time, he saw something else. Desperation. and a sliver of truth. "Then you better start talking," he said, his voice low. "And this time, tell me everything, the real story. Or I'll ride into town myself and tell Brody exactly where to find you." The story came tumbling out, a torrent of fear and desperation that made Stephen's own lonely life seem like a paradise. The man in the locket was Alistair Blackwood, a wealthy and powerful cattle baron from back east. Clara wasn't his wife. She'd been a maid in his house. Mabel was the cook. Their story of a dead husband and a robbed wagon was a complete fabrication, a shield to hide a much darker reality. Blackwood was a monster. He ruled his household with an iron fist and a cruel temper. He was unkind, Clara said, the word a pathetic substitute for the terror in her eyes, especially to the younger staff. One night, Blackwood came to her room, drunk and angry. He attacked her. She fought back, screaming, scratching. Mabel heard the commotion and burst in, wielding a heavy iron skillet. In the struggle, Blackwood stumbled backward. He tripped over a rug, his head hitting the corner of a heavy oak bed frame with a sickening crack. He was dead before he hit the floor. They panicked. They knew no one would believe their story. A powerful man like Blackwood against two lowly servants. It was a death sentence. They found his safe, stuffed with cash he kept for emergencies. They took it all and ran, vanishing into the night. They'd been running ever since, using the money to stay one step ahead of the lawmen Blackwood's family had undoubtedly hired. They chose Stephen's ranch because it was isolated, because the ghost rancher was known for keeping to himself. They thought he'd be the perfect mark, too lost in his own world to notice them. They never planned for him to be anything other than a fool. "Brody isn't a real lawman," Clara finished, her voice trembling. "He's a bounty hunter. Blackwood's family is paying him to find us and the money. They don't want a trial. They want us dead." Stephen stood there, the warmth of the fire doing nothing to chase the chill from his bones. He looked at these two women, really looked at them. They weren't hardened killers, they were terrified survivors. He thought of the woman he had loved, the one who had been taken from him by a man just like Blackwood. A man with too much power and not enough soul. Stephen had been young and foolish. He'd tried to fight, and for his trouble, he'd been beaten half to death and left in a ditch. He couldn't save her. He'd lived with that failure every single day. The ghost rancher wasn't just haunted by loneliness, he was haunted by his own weakness. Now, here was a second chance, a chance to stand up to the bullies, the Blackwoods and the Brodies of the world, a chance to do what he couldn't do all those years ago. He looked at Clara. "The money," he said. "Where is it?" Clara hesitated for a second, then went to her bag. She pulled out a thick leather satchel. It was heavy. "This is all of it," she said. Stephen took the bag and walked to the fireplace. Without a word, he opened the stove door and tossed the entire satchel into the roaring flames. Clara gasped. "What are you doing?" "Getting rid of the motive," Stephen said, watching the leather curl and the edges of the banknotes turn to black ash. "Brody isn't just after you, he's after this. Without it, he's just a man with a grudge." He turned back to them, his face set. "You're not leaving. You're staying here. He comes back, he'll find nothing. No women, no money. Just a ghost on a lonely ranch." For the first time, a flicker of genuine hope appeared in Clara's eyes. She saw him then, not as a mark, not as a threat, but as something else entirely, an ally. But they both knew this wasn't over. Brody would be back, and he wouldn't be coming to ask questions next time. The days that followed were a torment of waiting. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold a man with a gun. The bunkhouse was no longer safe, so Stephen moved them into the main cabin. They lived in the cramped space, the air thick with tension. He taught Clara how to use a rifle, her hands shaking at first, then growing steady. He showed them a hidden crawl space under the floorboards, a last resort if Brody came back unexpectedly. The deception was over. Now they were partners in a dangerous game. During those long, quiet nights, they started to talk. Really talk. He told her about his father, about the silence that had consumed him. He didn't tell her about the woman he'd lost, not yet. That wound was still too raw. But he let her see the man behind the stone-faced rancher. In return, she told him about her life before Blackwood, a simple life with hopes and dreams that had been stolen from her. She spoke of her real mother, who had died years ago, and how Mabel had become the only family she had left. They weren't mother and daughter by blood, but by circumstance and survival. He saw the fierce loyalty between them, and he respected it. One evening, as he was cleaning his shotgun by the fire, he finally asked the question that had been bothering him. "Brody, he was so sure you were here. How did he know to look for you in this valley?" Clara's face went pale. "There was a man," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "In the last town we were in. He was a trapper. He helped us, gave us food. We thought he was kind. I told him we were heading north, looking for work on an isolated ranch. A classic mistake. They had trusted the wrong person. Brody wasn't just a good tracker, he had an informant. He knew their general direction. He was likely circling the valley, checking every remote homestead. It was only a matter of time before he came back. And he'd be sure this time. He wouldn't leave empty-handed again." That night Stephen couldn't sleep. He stood on the porch, looking out at the vast, empty plains, under a sky filled with cold stars. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see Clara, wrapped in a blanket. "You should be sleeping," he said. "So should you," she replied softly. They stood in silence for a long time. "Why are you doing this, Stephen?" she finally asked. "Why are you helping us? You could have turned us in. You could have saved yourself." He stared out at the dark horizon. "Because I know what it's like," he said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "To have everything taken from you by a man who thinks he owns the world." And then he told her. He told her about Eleanor, the girl with laughter in her eyes. He told her about Marcus Thorne, a man with a smile like a razor and a soul like a snake. Thorne had wanted Eleanor, and what Thorne wanted, he took. Stephen had stood up to him, and Thorne had broken him, left him bleeding and broken while he rode away, with the only light in Stephen's life. He never saw her again. He'd spent a year healing, his body and his heart scarred over. When he was strong enough, he went looking for Thorne. He found him in a saloon in a dusty, forgotten town. He didn't go in with guns blazing. He just wanted to know where Eleanor was. Thorne laughed in his face. He said he'd gotten tired of her and sold her to a brothel down south. Something inside Stephen snapped. He didn't remember throwing the first punch. He just remembered the chaos, the splintering wood, the screams. When the dust settled, Thorne was dead, a broken bottle in his neck. It looked like a drunken brawl gone wrong. But there were whispers. People knew Stephen had a reason to want him dead. So he ran. He changed his name, bought this remote piece of land, and became a ghost, hoping his past would never find him. Clara listened, her eyes shining with unshed tears in the starlight. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. It was a small, simple gesture, but it felt like an anchor in the storm of his past. "So you're a killer too," she whispered. But there was no judgment in her voice, only a profound, heartbreaking understanding. "We're the same, you and I. We're both just ghosts." He looked at her then, at the woman who had lied to him and plotted to rob him, and he saw a reflection of his own brokenness. They were two fugitives, hiding from the world, haunted by the violence that had shaped them. And in that shared darkness, a fragile, unexpected bond was forged. But their moment of connection was shattered by a flicker of light on the horizon, a single lantern, bobbing in the distance, coming closer. It wasn't a posse this time, it was one rider, moving slow and steady, like he knew he had all the time in the world, and Stephen knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was Brody. Coming back to finish the job, it was a trap. Stephen knew it instantly. A full posse would make too much noise, give them too much time to hide or run. One man, riding slow and quiet, could get close, without being noticed. He was probably planning to scout the place out, wait for them to make a mistake. "Get inside," Stephen ordered Clara. "Get Mabel, under the floorboards, now." He grabbed his rifle and slipped out the back of the cabin, circling around through the darkness of the barn. He had the advantage. This was his land. He knew every dip, every shadow. Brody was walking into the ghost's territory. He watched from the hayloft as Brody dismounted, his movements cautious. He didn't go to the house. Instead, he started a slow circle of the property, his lantern held low, his eyes scanning for any sign of life. He was looking for tracks, for smoke, for a light in the window. He was being smart. Stephen held his breath, his rifle steady. He could end it right now, one shot, but he wasn't a murderer. Not like that. He had killed Thorne in a fit of rage, but to shoot a man in the back, even a man like Brody, he couldn't do it. There had to be another way. Brody made his way to the bunkhouse. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Stephen saw his chance. He slipped out of the barn and ran, silent as a shadow, to the main cabin. He went in, bolted the door, and dropped down to the floor, his ear pressed against the wood. "He's in the bunkhouse," he whispered to the women hidden below. "He's looking for you." He could hear the faint crunch of boots on the gravel outside as Brody came out of the bunkhouse and headed for the cabin. He was coming. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Silence. An agonizing, drawn-out silence. Then, a loud bang as Brody kicked the door. The old wood groaned but held. Another kick, and the frame splintered. The door flew open. Brody stood there, framed in the doorway, his pistol drawn. His weasel eyes scanned the empty room. He saw the cold fireplace, the empty chairs. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "I know you're in here, Hale. And I know you've got 'em. This can go one of two ways. You give 'em up, and I might just let you live." Stephen didn't move. He lay flat behind the heavy wooden table he'd overturned, his rifle aimed at the door. "They're not here, Brody," he called out. "You're wasting your time." Brody laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Oh, I've got plenty of time." He took a step inside, and then another. He was moving towards the center of the room, right towards the rug that covered the cellar entrance. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked under Brody's heavy boot. It was the one right next to the cellar door, the one Stephen knew was loose. Brody froze, his eyes darted down. He saw the edge of the rug, the faint outline of the trap door beneath it. His smile widened. "Well, well, well," he drawled. "Look what we have here." He kicked the rug aside, revealing the door. He knew. It was over. He raised his pistol, aiming it at the wooden planks. "Come on out," he shouted, "or I start shooting through the floor." From beneath him, Stephen heard a terrified whimper from Mabel. That was it. Time was up. In that split second, Stephen made his choice. He wasn't going to let Brody win. He burst up from behind the table, firing his rifle, not at Brody, but at the lantern hanging from the ceiling beam just above his head. The bullet shattered the glass. Oil and flame rained down. Brody yelled, jumping back, as the burning oil splashed onto the floor, instantly igniting the dry wooden planks and the rug. Fire. It was the last thing Brody expected. The flames spread with terrifying speed, licking up the walls, creating a wall of fire between Brody and the cellar door. The cabin was filling with thick black smoke. Brody was coughing, his eyes watering, disoriented. This was Stephen's chance. He charged through the smoke, tackling Brody hard. They crashed to the floor, the gun flying from Brody's hand. They wrestled, two desperate men in a burning room. Stephen was stronger, but Brody was wiry and fought dirty, his fingers gouging at Stephen's eyes. Outside, the world was on fire. Inside, it was a fight for survival. Stephen managed to land a solid punch on Brody's jaw, dazing him for a second. It was enough. He scrambled for Brody's pistol, his fingers closing around the cool metal. He got to his feet, aiming the gun at the gasping sheriff. "It's over, Brody," he yelled over the roar of the fire. But it wasn't, because in that moment, a new voice cut through the chaos from the doorway. "Drop it, Hale." Stephen's head snapped around. Standing there, silhouetted against the flames, was one of Brody's deputies. He must have been waiting outside, a backup plan, and his rifle was pointed straight at Stephen's heart. He was trapped. Brody staggered to his feet, a bloody grin on his face. "Looks like your luck just ran out, Ghost Rancher." The deputy took a step inside, his aim steady. "Told you this could go one of two ways." Stephen was caught. The fire was raging behind him, cutting off any escape. Brody was grinning, knowing he had won. The deputy's rifle was unwavering. "Now, kick the gun over here," the deputy said, "and tell your little lady friends to come on out." Stephen's mind raced. There was no way out. He could try to shoot the deputy, but the man was too far, his aim too good. He would be shot before he could even pull the trigger. He looked at Brody's triumphant face and felt a surge of cold fury. He was not going to let this man win. He was not going to fail again. Then he saw it. A flicker of movement behind the deputy, in the yard, illuminated by the hellish orange glow of the burning cabin. It was Clara. She had climbed out of the cellar through a small ventilation hatch on the far side of the house, a hatch Stephen had almost forgotten about. And in her hands, she was holding Stephen's heavy wood-cutting axe. Her face was a mask of terror and determination. The deputy hadn't seen her. His entire focus was on Stephen. Brody hadn't seen her. He was too busy savoring his victory. Stephen needed to create a diversion, just for a second. He looked the deputy dead in the eye. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low and calm. "You don't know the whole story." The deputy hesitated, just for a heartbeat. It was all Clara needed. She moved with a speed born of pure desperation, silent on the balls of her feet. She raised the axe high above her head, the firelight glinting off the polished steel. Brody saw her first. His eyes went wide with shock. "Behind you!" he screamed at his deputy, but it was too late. Clara brought the axe down, not with the sharp edge, but with the flat, heavy back of the head. She swung it like a sledgehammer, putting every ounce of her fear and rage into the blow. It struck the deputy squarely in the back of the head. He crumpled to the ground without a sound, unconscious. Brody stared, stunned. His moment of victory had literally been smashed to pieces. He fumbled for a backup pistol he had tucked in his belt, but Stephen was already moving. He lunged forward, ignoring the flames that licked at his clothes, and drove the butt of the pistol he was holding into Brody's temple. The sheriff went down hard. Silence descended, broken only by the hungry crackle of the fire. Stephen looked at Clara, who was standing there, the heavy axe trembling in her hands, her eyes wide with what she had just done. He ran to her, grabbing her arm. "We have to go. The whole place is going up." He pulled her toward the barn, yelling for Mabel to get out of the cellar. The old woman emerged, coughing from the smoke, and they half dragged, half carried her into the relative safety of the barn. They turned and watched as the roof of the cabin collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. Everything he owned was gone. His home, his possessions, all turned to ash. But as he looked at Clara and Mabel, huddled together but alive, he realized he hadn't lost anything that truly mattered. They tied up Brody and his deputy, gagging them and leaving them in the horse stalls. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins of his life, Stephen knew they couldn't stay. Brody's other men would come looking for him. They had to run. But where? They were three fugitives with no home, no money, and the law on their trail. It seemed hopeless. But as Clara tended to a burn on his arm, her touch gentle, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just hope. It was a reason to fight. "I know a place," he said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "An old line cabin in the mountains. It's hidden. We can lay low there, figure out our next move." The journey was brutal. They took the best horses and rode hard, pushing north into the rugged, unforgiving mountains. Mabel, weakened by the smoke and the terror, struggled to keep up. Clara was a pillar of strength, her earlier fear replaced by a steely resolve. And Stephen. Stephen felt alive for the first time in a decade. The ghost was gone, replaced by a man with a purpose. Protect these women. They found the cabin, a dilapidated wreck barely clinging to the side of a mountain. But it was shelter, it was defensible, and it was a secret. Days turned into weeks. They survived on what Stephen could hunt and trap. The bond between him and Clara deepened in the shared hardship and isolation. The silences between them were no longer filled with suspicion, but with a comfortable understanding. They were a team, a family of sorts, but their peace was fragile. One afternoon, while scouting the valley below, Stephen saw them. A new posse, larger than Brody's. And they were being led by a man in a fine suit, riding a magnificent black horse. Even from a distance, Stephen recognized the cold, cruel face from the locket. It was Alistair Blackwood's brother, come to personally oversee the hunt. And this man looked far more dangerous and far more competent than Sheriff Brody ever was. They had been found. The hunt was on again. Blackwood's brother, whose name they learned was Julian, was methodical. He set up a camp in the valley and began a systematic search of the mountains. He had trackers, experienced men who knew the wilderness. Stephen knew their little cabin wouldn't stay hidden for long. They were trapped. "We can't outrun them," Stephen said one night as they watched the distant campfires flicker like angry eyes in the darkness. "We have to make a stand." "Here." Clara looked at him, her face grim. "How? There are a dozen of them." "This is my ground," Stephen said, a dangerous glint in his eye. "They're hunters, but I'm the ghost in these mountains. We won't fight them head on. We'll pick them off one by one. We'll make them afraid of the shadows." And so began a new war. Stephen used his knowledge of the mountains to his advantage. He set traps, snares that would hoist a man into the air, pits filled with sharpened stakes. He created rock slides that would block paths and separate the search parties. He became a phantom, striking and vanishing before they even knew what was happening. Clara became his eyes and ears, watching the tracker's movements from a high ridge, signaling him with bird calls. The hunters became the hunted. Fear began to creep into Blackwood's camp. Men started whispering about a demon in the mountains, a spirit protecting the two women. They were losing their nerve. Julian Blackwood, however, was not a man to be deterred by superstition. He was enraged. He realized he was dealing with someone who knew the terrain, someone skilled and deadly. He changed tactics. He couldn't find them, so he decided to smoke them out. He ordered his men to set fires. They started at the base of the mountain, a ring of fire designed to sweep upwards and force anyone hiding on the slopes out into the open. The wind was in their favor. The flames roared to life, a devouring orange beast consuming everything in its path. Stephen and Clara watched in horror from their perch as the fire line advanced. The smoke was getting thicker, burning their lungs. Their hidden cabin was directly in the fire's path. They were trapped between a wall of flame and a dozen men with guns waiting for them below. "We have to go through it," Stephen yelled over the roar of the fire. "There's a stream on the other side of this ridge. If we can get to it, we can follow it down the mountain." It was a desperate, suicidal plan. The heat was already intense, the air shimmering. Mabel was too weak to make it. She knew it. "You go," she said, her voice a frail whisper. "I'll only slow you down. I'm not afraid, Clara. I'm just tired." Clara was sobbing, refusing to leave her. "No, I won't leave you." Stephen grabbed Clara's shoulders. "We have no choice. It's what she wants. It's the only way her sacrifice means anything." He saw the same fierce loyalty in Mabel's eyes that he'd seen in Clara's. She was giving her friend, her adopted daughter, a chance to live. With a final, heartbreaking goodbye, they left her. They soaked blankets in their remaining water, wrapped them around their heads, and plunged into the inferno. The heat was unimaginable. It was like running through the gates of hell. Embers rained down, searing their skin. The smoke was a choking, blinding fog. Stephen held Clara's hand, pulling her along, his only guide the slope of the land and the memory of the stream. He could hear the shouts of Blackwood's men below, but they were a world away. There was only the fire and the desperate need to survive. They stumbled out of the fire line, collapsing on the banks of the stream, their clothes smoldering, their lungs screaming for air. They were alive, battered, burned, but alive. They looked back. The entire mountaintop was engulfed in flames. Their sanctuary and Mabel were gone. Grief would have to wait. They followed the stream down into a deep, rocky canyon where the horses couldn't follow. They were on foot now, with nothing but the clothes on their backs. But they were free of the fire, and Blackwood's men were on the wrong side of the mountain. They had a head start. They walked for days, surviving on berries and roots, moving under the cover of darkness. They were ragged, exhausted, and heartbroken. But they were together. In the crucible of the fire, their bond had been forged into something unbreakable. One night, huddled together for warmth under a rock outcropping, he looked at her, her face illuminated by the moon, smudged with soot, but still beautiful. "I didn't mean to fall for you," he murmured, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. She smiled, a real smile, the first he'd seen in weeks. "Then let's keep falling together," she whispered back. They made it out of the mountains and into the next territory, a place where no one knew their faces. They found work on a small farm, two nameless, hard-working drifters. They started to build a new life, a quiet life. They thought they had finally escaped. They were wrong. One day, in the nearest town for supplies, Stephen saw a new wanted poster. It had a crude drawing of his face and Clara's. But the name wasn't Hale. It was his real name, the one he had buried years ago. And the poster wasn't from Brody or Blackwood. It was from the U.S. Marshals. Their pasts had finally, truly caught up with them. Julian Blackwood hadn't given up. He'd used his money and influence to turn their local crime into a federal manhunt. There was nowhere left to run. This time, Stephen didn't suggest running. He was tired of running. He was tired of being a ghost. "We go back," he said to Clara that night. "We go back and we face them. We tell the truth, all of it." It was the most terrifying idea in the world. But Clara nodded. She was tired of running too. They turned themselves in to the marshal in the next town over. The story they told was so incredible, so full of violence and corruption and survival, that at first, no one believed them. But Stephen knew things. He knew about Sheriff Brody's corruption. He knew about Julian Blackwood's illegal land grabs. And he could prove it. The deputy Clara had knocked out had a change of heart. Facing prison, he confessed everything about Brody's bounty hunting and Blackwood's plan. The trial was a sensation. A quiet ghost rancher and a former maid against one of the most powerful families in the West. But the truth has a way of cutting through money and influence. Clara's story of self-defense was believed. She was acquitted. Stephen's old murder charge was re-examined. It turned out Marcus Thorne, the man he'd killed, was a wanted criminal himself, with a long history of violence against women. Stephen's actions were reclassified as self-defense. He was a free man. Julian Blackwood and Sheriff Brody were indicted on a dozen charges, their reign of corruption brought to an end by the two people they had tried to crush. They returned to the valley. The ranch was a ruin, just a blackened chimney standing against the sky. But the land was still there. The land was theirs. They rebuilt, board by board, nail by nail. The silence that returned was not the silence of loneliness, but the quiet peace of a life earned. The neighbors, who had once whispered about the ghost rancher, now spoke his name with respect. They had faced down monsters and won. One evening, as the sun set over their new home, Clara stood on the porch, looking out at the plains. "Do you ever miss the silence?" she asked. Stephen came and stood beside her, putting his arm around her. "No," he said, his voice full of a warmth she had never heard before. "This is better." The house was no longer a place of echoes, but of a future they had fought for, bled for, and built together, proving that even in the harshest winds, two broken souls could find a way to make a home. It just goes to show you that the past never really stays buried, and sometimes the only way to escape your ghosts is to turn around and face them head on. If you enjoyed this story of justice and survival, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know what secrets are hiding out there in the dark.